February 1, 1944. The Narva River in northeastern Estonia froze solid under -20 degrees Celsius cold as 1 million Soviet soldiers prepared to launch the most concentrated offensive of the Eastern Front winter campaign. General Leonid Govorov commanded the Leningrad front with orders from Stalin himself to break through German defenses at Narva, drive across Estonia, and cut off Army Group North from the rest of the Wehrmacht before spring mud made mobile warfare impossible. Opposite him, General Johannes Friesner commanded a mixed force of 200,000 German Wehrmacht soldiers, Waffen-SS units, and Estonian volunteers who understood they were fighting not just to hold a river line, but to prevent Soviet occupation of their homeland. The Narva River, barely 100 meters wide at most points, separated these massive armies across a front only 12 kilometers long. This narrow killing ground would consume over 200,000 lives in 6 months of continuous combat that produced casualties exceeding the entire D-Day invasion, yet remains almost completely forgotten by history. The strategic importance of Narva in early 1944 cannot be overstated because holding this small Estonian city meant controlling the gateway to the entire Baltic region. If Soviet forces broke through at Narva, they could sweep north into Finland, forcing that country out of the war, or drive west through Estonia and Latvia to reach the Baltic Sea and trap massive German forces in a pocket with their backs against the ocean. For Germany, losing Narva meant losing Army Group North, losing access to Baltic ports, losing the Estonian oil shale deposits that provided crucial fuel, and potentially losing Finland as an ally. For Estonia, the battle represented an existential crisis, because everyone understood that Soviet victory meant brutal occupation, mass deportations, and the destruction of Estonian national identity that Stalin's regime had already begun in 1940, before German invasion interrupted it. The defenders at Narva included approximately 100,000 Wehrmacht soldiers from various German divisions that had been worn down by 2 years of continuous combat on the Eastern Front. Another 50,000 Waffen-SS troops, including foreign volunteer units, and crucially about 50,000 Estonian volunteers who had enlisted in German organized units specifically to defend their homeland against Soviet return. These Estonian soldiers faced an impossible moral situation because they were fighting under German command alongside an occupying power that had committed terrible crimes. Yet the alternative of Soviet occupation promised deportations and executions based on Stalin's 1940-1941 policies in the Baltic states. Most Estonian volunteers understood they were choosing between two evils and picked the one that offered any possibility of eventual Estonian independence rather than guaranteed absorption into the Soviet Union. The Soviet offensive began at dawn on February 1st, with an artillery barrage that shook the frozen earth and announced the beginning of 6 months of uninterrupted combat. Over 3,000 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars concentrated fire on a front barely 12 kilometers wide, creating a density of firepower rarely seen even on the Eastern Front, where massive artillery preparations were standard practice. The barrage lasted 4 hours and reduced most of Narva's remaining buildings to rubble, while killing hundreds of German and Estonian defenders in their positions along the riverbank. When the guns finally stopped, Soviet infantry and tanks attacked across the frozen Narva River on a front so narrow that units became hopelessly intermingled, and commanders lost control as the battle devolved into a savage close-quarters fight in the city ruins. The first day of fighting cost the Soviets approximately 5,000 casualties as German machine guns and artillery cut down attacking waves, while hidden anti-tank guns destroyed T-34 tanks attempting to cross the ice. Soviet commanders responded exactly as they had throughout the war by simply feeding more troops into the attack without pausing to adjust tactics or consider alternative approaches. And this stubborn insistence on frontal assault despite horrific casualties characterized the entire 6-month battle. By February 5th, Soviet forces had pushed into western Narva and established bridgeheads on the German-held side of the river, but these gains cost over 20,000 casualties in 5 days of fighting, while German losses approached 5,000 killed and wounded. General Govorov paused the offensive on February 6th to bring up reinforcements and ammunition because the intensity of fighting had exhausted his forward units and depleted ammunition stocks faster than supply lines could replenish them. This pause gave German defenders time to strengthen their positions and bring up reserves including fresh SS divisions and additional Estonian volunteer battalions that were completing training. Both sides used the brief respite to evacuate their wounded, bury their dead when possible, and prepare for the next round of fighting that everyone knew was coming soon. The March offensive began on March 1st with even greater fury than February's attacks because Stalin had directly ordered Govorov to break through at Narva regardless of casualties. Viewing the battle as a test of Red Army offensive capability that needed to succeed to prove that German defenses could still be overcome despite Wehrmacht's skilled defensive tactics. Soviet artillery preparation on March 1st lasted 6 hours and involved over 4,000 guns firing at maximum rate, and the noise of the barrage could be heard over 100 kilometers away in Tallinn. When the guns lifted, Soviet infantry attacked in human waves reminiscent of World War I, advancing in dense formations that made machine gun fire devastatingly effective, but also overwhelmed defenders through sheer numbers. The fighting in March became known among German soldiers as the meat grinder of Narva, because the concentrated attacks on such a narrow front created casualty rates approaching those of the worst Western Front battles of 1916–1917. Soviet divisions would attack with 10,000 men and be reduced to 3,000 effectives within 48 hours. Yet fresh divisions would immediately replace them and continue attacking the same positions. German defenders suffered their own terrible losses, with entire companies being wiped out and regiments reduced to battalion strength, but reinforcements arrived more slowly for the Germans, meaning that surviving units became progressively weaker as March continued. Estonian volunteers fighting in German organized units suffered disproportionate casualties during March because German commanders often assigned them to the most dangerous positions, viewing them as expendable compared to German troops. This created considerable resentment among Estonian soldiers who were fighting to defend their own homeland, yet being treated as second-class troops by their supposed allies. Despite this poor treatment, Estonian units generally fought with extreme determination, because surrender to Soviet forces meant certain execution as traitors, while German captivity might eventually lead to release. The civilian population of Narva, approximately 5,000 people who had not evacuated before fighting began, found themselves trapped in a hell of artillery fire and house-to-house combat as the city changed hands multiple times during March. Civilians sheltered in basements and cellars while battles raged overhead, and many died from artillery hits or were killed in crossfire when buildings they sheltered in became combat positions. German authorities eventually organized evacuation of remaining civilians in mid-March, but several hundred died during the evacuation when Soviet artillery caught the refugee column. By the end of March, Soviet forces had pushed German defenders out of Narva city proper and established solid positions on the western bank of the river, but attempts to break through into the Estonian countryside beyond had failed completely. The fighting had cost the Soviets approximately 70,000 casualties, while German and Estonian losses approached 25,000, creating an exchange ratio of nearly 3-to-1 that Soviet commanders considered acceptable given their numerical superiority. German commanders recognized they could not sustain such losses indefinitely and began constructing a new defensive line in the hills west of Narva, a position that would become known as the Tannenberg Line after a World War I German victory in East Prussia. The Tannenberg Line represented prepared defensive positions constructed over several weeks using forced labor from Estonian civilians and captured Soviet POWs. The line consisted of deep trenches with overhead cover, concrete bunkers for machine guns and anti-tank weapons, multiple belts of barbed wire, and extensive minefields covering the approaches. The position took advantage of natural high ground on hills overlooking the coastal plain, giving defenders excellent fields of fire and observation over any attacking force. German engineers created a defense in depth with multiple fallback positions, so that even if Soviets broke through the first line, they would face fresh defenses behind it. April and May brought relative quiet to the Narva sector as both sides rebuilt their strength and prepared for the next round of fighting. Soviet commanders pulled forward fresh divisions from reserve and accumulated massive ammunition stocks for the summer offensive, while German forces fortified the Tannenberg Line and trained Estonian volunteer battalions that continued joining the defense. The spring thaw turned the battlefield into a muddy nightmare that made movement difficult, and gave soldiers on both sides a brief respite from continuous combat, though artillery exchanges and patrol actions continued throughout the quiet months. Soviet military intelligence during this period completely failed to recognize the strength of the Tannenberg Line defenses, and Soviet commanders planned their July offensive assuming they faced field fortifications similar to those they had encountered in March, rather than the prepared positions that actually existed. This intelligence failure would cost tens of thousands of lives when the summer offensive began, because Soviet tactics assumed they could overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers and firepower, when in reality, the Tannenberg Line required either a lengthy siege or a fundamental change in approach. The July offensive that began on July 25th involved over 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, attacking the Tannenberg Line with orders to break through to the Baltic Sea within 2 weeks. Stalin personally demanded rapid success because he wanted to knock Finland out of the war before Finland could negotiate a separate peace with Germany, and he believed that crushing German defenses at Narva would convince Finnish leaders that continuing the fight was hopeless. The artillery preparation for the July offensive lasted 12 hours and involved over 5,000 guns, firing in the most intense barrage of the entire Narva campaign. When Soviet infantry and tanks attacked on July 26th, they ran directly into the prepared defenses of the Tannenberg Line and suffered catastrophic casualties within the first few hours. German machine guns firing from concrete bunkers cut down attacking waves, while anti-tank weapons destroyed Soviet armor attempting to break through. The first day cost the Soviets over 10,000 casualties while barely denting the German defensive line, yet Soviet commanders continued feeding troops into the attack throughout July 26 and 27, without pausing to reconsider their approach. Estonian volunteers defending the Tannenberg Line fought with desperate courage because they understood this battle would determine their nation's fate, and their defensive positions became legendary among German forces for the ferocity with which they were held. One Estonian battalion of approximately 1,000 men held a key position on the Tannenberg Line for 5 days against continuous Soviet attacks that reduced the battalion to fewer than 200 survivors. Yet the position never fell and had to be evacuated only when German forces on both flanks withdrew, making the position untenable. The fighting in late July became even more intense than the March meat grinder as Soviet commanders threw fresh divisions into battle as quickly as transport could bring them forward. By July 30th, Soviet casualties from 5 days of fighting exceeded 50,000, while German and Estonian losses approached 15,000. Yet the Tannenberg Line remained intact, and Soviet forces had advanced barely 2 kilometers from their starting positions. The failure of the July offensive infuriated Stalin, who blamed his commanders for incompetence, rather than acknowledging that the defensive position was simply too strong to take by frontal assault. August brought the final major Soviet offensive of the Narva campaign, when Govorov concentrated over 300,000 troops for one more attempt to break the Tannenberg Line before autumn weather made offensive operations impossible. The August attacks beginning on August 10th followed the same pattern as previous offensives, with massive artillery preparation, followed by infantry and tank attacks on a narrow front. The results were equally predictable, with Soviet forces suffering enormous casualties while making minimal progress against prepared German defenses. The deadliest single day of the entire Narva campaign occurred on August 12th, when Soviet forces launched coordinated attacks all along the Tannenberg Line, using every available unit in an attempt to overwhelm defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The attacks failed catastrophically, with Soviet casualties exceeding 15,000 in one day, while German and Estonian losses approached 3,000. The exchange ratio of 5-1 marked the worst day of the campaign for Soviet forces, yet attacks continued on August 13th and 14th, following the same failed tactics. By mid-August, German High Command made the strategic decision to abandon the Narva position, not because Soviet attacks had broken through, but because the Red Army had achieved major breakthroughs in other sectors of the Eastern Front, making the Narva salient untenable. Army Group North faced encirclement if it remained at Narva, while Soviet forces swept through Latvia to its south, so German commanders ordered a fighting withdrawal that abandoned the positions they had held for 6 months. Estonian volunteers faced a terrible choice during this withdrawal because retreating west meant leaving their homeland to Soviet occupation. while staying behind meant certain death or deportation. The final casualty count from 6 months of fighting at Narva exceeded 200,000 killed from both sides, with approximately 130,000 Soviet dead and 70,000 German and Estonian dead. Wounded numbers remain uncertain, but probably exceeded 400,000 total, making the campaign one of the bloodiest of the entire Eastern Front. To put these casualties in perspective, the D-Day invasion of Normandy cost approximately 10,000 Allied casualties on the first day, and perhaps 100,000 total casualties in the first month, including all combatants, making Narva's casualty toll substantially larger than history's most famous invasion. Yet the Battle of Narva remains almost completely unknown outside of Estonia and military history specialists, because it fit neither the Soviet narrative of continuous victories in 1944 nor the Western narrative focusing on D-Day and the liberation of France. Soviet historians after the war deliberately minimized the Narva campaign because the casualty ratios and failed offensives did not fit the heroic narrative of the Red Army's march to Berlin. Western historians largely ignored it because the battle occurred on the Eastern Front, where hundreds of similar battles were fought, and because Estonia's fate seemed predetermined, regardless of what happened at Narva. The Estonian perspective on the Battle of Narva remains deeply complex and emotionally charged, because the battle represented the last major attempt to prevent Soviet reoccupation, yet ultimately failed, leading to 50 years of Soviet occupation, mass deportations, and suppression of Estonian national identity. Many Estonians who fought at Narva were later persecuted by Soviet authorities as Nazi collaborators despite having fought to defend their homeland. And discussing the battle remained dangerous in Soviet-occupied Estonia until independence was restored in 1991. The soldiers who fought at Narva on both sides experienced some of the most intense combat of World War II, with casualty rates exceeding even Stalingrad's worst periods when measured as percentage of forces engaged per day. German soldiers called it the worst battle they fought on the Eastern Front, because the concentrated nature of combat on such a narrow front meant no position offered safety, and survival became matter of random chance rather than skill or courage. Soviet soldiers remembered it as a place where entire divisions disappeared into the meat grinder, never to be reconstituted, where commanders spent lives like ammunition, and where the only certainty was that attack orders meant death. The comparison with D-Day illuminates why the Battle of Narva deserves greater recognition in World War II history, despite remaining almost unknown. D-Day involved approximately 150,000 Allied troops landing on June 6, 1944, with first-day casualties around 10,000 and one-month casualties totaling perhaps 100,000, including all combatants. The Narva campaign involved over 1 million combatants during its 6 months, with casualties exceeding 200,000 killed and perhaps 400,000 wounded. The strategic importance was comparable because Narva controlled access to the Baltic region just as Normandy controlled access to Western Europe. Yet historical memory treats them entirely differently, with D-Day celebrated as the decisive battle of Western Europe, while Narva remains forgotten. The reasons for this historical disparity include the obvious fact that D-Day was an Allied victory, opening the path to German defeat, while Narva was ultimately a Soviet victory that Western audiences cared less about. More fundamentally, D-Day fit narratives of heroic liberation that all participants wanted to celebrate, while Narva involved morally complex situations, like Estonians fighting alongside Germans against Soviets that resisted simple heroic framing. The sheer horror of the casualty ratios at Narva also made it an uncomfortable battle to commemorate because it raised questions about Soviet military tactics that treated soldiers as expendable resources. Modern Estonia commemorates the Battle of Narva carefully because it represents both national resistance to Soviet occupation and collaboration with Nazi Germany in ways that resist simple moral judgments. Estonian veterans of the battle are honored for defending their homeland, while acknowledgement is given that they fought as part of German organized forces committing terrible crimes elsewhere, even if the Estonian units themselves were not directly involved in those crimes. This moral complexity makes the battle difficult to fit into either heroic resistance narratives or straightforward condemnation. The Tannenberg Line defensive positions remain partially preserved in Estonia as historical sites where visitors can see the trenches, bunkers, and fortifications that produced such terrible casualties in 1944. The sites receive relatively few visitors because tourism focuses on Tallinn's medieval old town and Estonia's natural beauty rather than grim military history. Yet for those interested in World War II's Eastern Front, these positions offer powerful physical evidence of the scale and intensity of the fighting. The human cost of the Battle of Narva extended far beyond the 200,000 killed in combat, because the battle's aftermath brought Soviet occupation, mass deportations, and decades of repression for Estonia. Thousands of Estonian soldiers who fought at Narva and survived were later arrested by Soviet security forces and sent to gulags in Siberia, where many died. Families of Estonian volunteers faced discrimination and persecution throughout the Soviet period because having fought against the Red Army marked entire families as enemies of the state. The tactical lessons from Narva include the demonstration that even in 1944, when Soviet forces had achieved massive superiority in numbers and equipment, well-prepared defensive positions could still resist even the heaviest attacks if defenders had sufficient depth and support. The battle also showed the terrible cost of Soviet offensive tactics that relied on overwhelming defenders through sheer numbers rather than maneuver or combined arms coordination. German defenders at Narva inflicted casualty ratios of 3-to-1 or better throughout the campaign by maximizing the advantages of prepared positions and skilled defensive tactics. The Battle of Narva stands as testament to the forgotten soldiers and battles of World War II's Eastern Front, where millions died in conflicts that receive little recognition in Western historical memory. The soldiers who fought at Narva experienced combat as intense as any battle of the war and died in numbers exceeding famous Western Front engagements, yet their sacrifice remains largely unknown. The Estonian volunteers who fought to defend their homeland from reoccupation deserve recognition for their courage, even while acknowledging the moral complexity of fighting alongside German forces. The Soviet soldiers who died attacking the Tannenberg line deserve remembrance as victims of tactical incompetence and Stalin's strategic obsessions, rather than just statistics in a forgotten battle. The legacy of Narva reminds us that World War II consisted of thousands of battles beyond the famous few that dominate historical memory, that the Eastern Front produced casualties and suffering on scales that dwarf Western Front battles, and that moral complexity often resists the simplified narratives of good versus evil that popular history prefers. The 200,000 men who died at Narva fought for nations, ideologies, and survival with courage and determination that deserves recognition regardless of which side they fought for or which cause ultimately prevailed. Their forgotten sacrifice in Estonia's frozen mud and summer dust speaks to the terrible human cost of total war and the capricious nature of historical memory that celebrates some battles while consigning others to obscurity. The specific tactical pattern that repeated throughout the Narva campaign revealed fundamental differences between Soviet and German approaches to offensive and defensive warfare in 1944. Soviet attacks typically began with massive artillery preparation lasting hours and involving thousands of guns firing at maximum rate to suppress German defenses and destroy fortifications. This preparatory bombardment certainly caused casualties and disrupted German defensive preparations, but it also telegraphed exactly where and when attacks would come, giving defenders time to pull back from forward positions and prepare counterattacks. When Soviet infantry finally attacked, they typically did so in dense formations that German machine gunners called target-rich environments, where a single MG-42 could inflict dozens of casualties within minutes. German defensive tactics at Narva emphasized defense in depth with multiple defensive lines so that Soviet penetration of the first line merely exposed attacking forces to fire from prepared positions behind. German commanders positioned their strongest units not in the forward trenches where Soviet artillery could destroy them, but in reserve positions from which they could launch immediate counterattacks against any Soviet breakthrough. This elastic defense frustrated Soviet commanders who found that even successful attacks quickly bogged down when counterattacked by fresh German reserves. Yet Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized holding ground once taken rather than mobile exploitation, making it difficult for them to capitalize on local successes before German counterattacks sealed any breaches. The casualty statistics from individual attacks during the Narva campaign demonstrate the terrible effectiveness of German defensive tactics against Soviet assault methods. On March 8, 1944, Soviet forces launched a major attack using 2 full divisions, approximately 20,000 men, against a sector of the Narva line held by one reinforced German regiment of about 3,000 soldiers. The attack began with a 6-hour artillery barrage, followed by infantry assault supported by 50 tanks. By the end of the day, Soviet forces had advanced approximately 500 meters and occupied the first line of German trenches at a cost of 6,000 casualties, including 1,500 dead. German losses were approximately 400 killed and wounded. The next day, German counterattacks recaptured most of the lost ground, inflicting another 2,000 Soviet casualties while losing 200 Germans. This pattern repeated dozens of times throughout the campaign, with local variations but always producing casualty ratios heavily favoring the defenders. The experience of ordinary Soviet soldiers attacking at Narva has been preserved in letters and memoirs that Soviet censors allowed to be published decades after the war, once the political climate permitted more honest discussion of military failures. One Soviet infantry sergeant described his experience during the March offensive. "We formed up before dawn in the assembly trenches. There were so many of us packed together, you couldn't move without bumping into someone. The artillery opened fire and we couldn't hear ourselves think. It went on for hours until our ears were ringing even with the noise. Then the whistles blew and we went over the top. The Germans had machine guns positioned perfectly to cover every approach. Men were falling all around me. I made it perhaps 50 meters before I was hit in the leg. I lay in no man's land for 6 hours before stretcher bearers could reach me. I watched 3 more waves attack over the same ground. None of them got as far as I did. The whole field was covered with our dead." German soldiers defending at Narva left similarly vivid accounts of the intensity of combat and the sheer scale of Soviet attacks. One Wehrmacht corporal, manning an MG-42 position, wrote, "The Russians attacked in waves that seemed endless. We would cut down one wave and another would appear through the smoke. My assistant gunner was killed by artillery, but his replacement arrived within minutes. We fired so many belts that the barrel glowed red, and we had to change it 3 times in one afternoon. The entire position was covered in spent shell casings ankle deep. When darkness finally fell and they stopped attacking, I counted over 100 Russian bodies in front of our position within 50 meters. We had killed more men in one day than our entire company's strength." Estonian volunteer soldiers fighting at Narva faced unique pressures because they were defending their literal homes and families from an enemy they knew would show no mercy if victorious. One Estonian lieutenant commanding a company in the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division described the psychological burden. "We knew that every meter of ground we lost brought the Soviets closer to our homes. Many of the men had families in villages behind the Tannenberg line. We weren't fighting for Hitler or Nazi ideology, we were fighting for Estonia's existence. The Germans treated us as expendable and gave us the worst positions, but we held them because we had no choice. Surrender meant death or Siberia. Retreat meant abandoning our families. So we fought with everything we had." The Soviet perspective on Estonian volunteers fighting for Germany involved viewing them as traitors and fascist collaborators deserving no mercy, and Soviet political officers made clear to attacking troops that Estonian prisoners should not be taken. This created a particularly vicious dynamic in sectors where Estonian units faced Soviet forces, because both sides understood the battle was to the death, with no possibility of honorable surrender. Soviet commissars told their men that Estonian fascists had committed terrible crimes during German occupation and deserved execution, while Estonian soldiers knew that Soviet victory meant deportation for themselves and their families. This mutual understanding that quarter would not be given or accepted made combat in Estonian defended sectors even bloodier than elsewhere along the line. The month of June 1944 brought relative quiet to Narva as both sides rebuilt strength and prepared for the next major offensive. But this quiet period still saw daily artillery exchanges and patrol actions that killed hundreds. German forces used June to strengthen the Tannenberg line defenses by adding more concrete bunkers, laying additional minefields, and constructing second and third defensive lines behind the first. Soviet forces spent June bringing forward fresh divisions to replace those worn down in previous fighting and accumulating massive ammunition stockpiles for the planned July offensive. The Soviet summer offensive beginning July 25, 1944, represented the largest single operation of the entire Narva campaign, with over 500,000 troops committed to breaking the Tannenberg line and driving to the Baltic Sea. Soviet planning for this offensive assumed that overwhelming numerical superiority and massive firepower would inevitably break German defenses regardless of their strength, following the doctrine that had succeeded in breaking German lines elsewhere on the Eastern Front during the summer of 1944. What Soviet planners failed to appreciate was that the Tannenberg line represented prepared fortifications, constructed specifically to resist exactly the kind of frontal assault they intended to launch. The opening artillery barrage for the July offensive began at 0600 hours on July 25th and continued until 1800 hours that evening, 12 hours of continuous fire from over 5,000 guns, creating the most intense bombardment of the entire campaign. The barrage consumed over 100,000 artillery shells and reduced much of the visible fortifications along the Tannenberg line to rubble, killing hundreds of defenders and creating an apocalyptic landscape of craters and destroyed bunkers. Soviet commanders watching from observation posts believed the barrage had succeeded in destroying German defenses and assumed the infantry assault would sweep through with minimal resistance. When Soviet infantry and tanks attacked at 1800 hours on July 25th, they discovered that the 12-hour bombardment had inflicted less damage than expected because German defenders had sheltered in deep bunkers during the barrage and emerged to man their weapons when the guns stopped. The first wave of Soviet attackers ran directly into intense machine gun and anti-tank fire that cut them down within minutes and destroyed a dozen tanks before they could advance 200 meters. Subsequent waves fared no better as German defenders fought with desperate intensity, knowing that failure here meant the entire defensive position would collapse. The fighting on July 26th became even more intense as Soviet commanders committed their armor reserves in an attempt to break through by sheer weight of metal, sending over 200 tanks against a narrow sector of the Tannenberg line defended by German and Estonian troops with extensive anti-tank weapons. The resulting battle destroyed over 100 Soviet tanks in a single day, while German losses included perhaps 20 tanks and assault guns. The burning tank wrecks created a literal wall of fire that blocked further Soviet advances and gave defenders time to reorganize and strengthen their positions. Soviet casualties during the first 3 days of the July offensive, July 25-27, exceeded 30,000 killed and wounded, while German and Estonian losses approached 8,000. Creating an exchange ratio of nearly 4-1 that demonstrated the terrible effectiveness of prepared defenses against frontal assault. Yet Soviet commanders continued the offensive throughout late July and early August by feeding fresh divisions into the battle as quickly as transport could bring them forward from reserve areas. This willingness to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of breakthrough characterized Soviet offensive doctrine throughout the war, and reflected Stalin's belief that the Soviet Union's population advantage over Germany made trading lives at unfavorable ratios acceptable if it eventually produced strategic results. The human cost of these repeated offensives fell hardest on Soviet rifle divisions that bore the burden of attacking prepared positions while supported by inadequate artillery and armor coordination. A typical Soviet rifle division began the July offensive with approximately 10,000 troops, organized into 3 rifle regiments, supporting artillery and attached tank units. After 5 days of continuous offensive operations, the same division might be reduced to 4,000 effectives, with remaining units utterly exhausted from sleep deprivation, casualties among officers and NCOs that disrupted unit cohesion, and demoralization from watching comrades die in failed attacks. Soviet practice was to pull such divisions from the line for rest and replacement. But the intensity of combat at Narva meant many divisions returned to action after only minimal rest and incomplete replacement, leaving them chronically under strength throughout the campaign. The German perspective on the July offensive acknowledged that Soviet numerical superiority was beginning to tell despite favorable casualty ratios, because German losses were difficult to replace, while Soviet reinforcements seemed inexhaustible. One German battalion commander wrote in his diary on July 30th, "We have held the line and inflicted terrible casualties on the Bolsheviks, but we are bleeding too. My battalion started this offensive with 800 men. We now number 350 effectives. Replacements trickle in, but never enough to restore full strength. Meanwhile, the Russians keep attacking with fresh divisions. I do not know how much longer we can hold." The Estonian volunteers fighting at Narva during the July offensive suffered casualties approaching 40% of their total strength, as German commanders continued using them to hold the most dangerous positions. The 20th Waffen Grenadier Division, composed primarily of Estonian volunteers, began the July offensive with approximately 15,000 men and ended it with fewer than 9,000 effectives after brutal combat on the most exposed sections of the Tannenberg line. Despite these horrific casualties, Estonian units maintained their defensive positions and continued fighting with determination, born of desperate need to prevent Soviet breakthrough. The final major Soviet offensive of the Narva campaign began August 10, 1944, with Stalin personally ordering one more massive effort to break the Tannenberg line before autumn weather made offensive operations impossible. Soviet forces committed over 300,000 troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, in coordinated attacks along the entire Narva sector, representing the largest concentration of forces in the campaign. The August offensive followed the same pattern as previous attacks, with massive artillery preparation, followed by infantry and tank assaults on narrow fronts. And it produced the same results, with catastrophic Soviet casualties and minimal territorial gains. The single bloodiest day of the entire Narva campaign occurred on August 12, 1944, when Soviet forces launched simultaneous attacks all along the Tannenberg line, using every available unit in an all-out effort to overwhelm German defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The attacks began at dawn with artillery preparation and continued throughout the day, with wave after wave of Soviet infantry and tanks assaulting prepared German positions. By nightfall, Soviet casualties exceeded 15,000 killed and wounded, while German and Estonian losses approached 3,000, creating the worst single-day exchange ratio of the entire campaign at approximately 5-1 in favor of the defenders. The tactical reasons for this catastrophic Soviet failure on August 12 included inadequate reconnaissance that failed to identify the true strength of German positions, poor coordination between infantry and armor that left attacking infantry without tank support at critical moments, and German defensive tactics that focused overwhelming firepower on narrow sectors of the Soviet attack, creating killing zones where casualties mounted exponentially. Soviet commanders recognized these problems but felt unable to change tactics because their doctrine emphasized massing forces for frontal breakthrough rather than the more complex maneuver warfare that might have found weak points in German defenses. The strategic decision by German high command to abandon the Narva position in late August came not because Soviet attacks had broken through, but because other sectors of the Eastern Front had collapsed, leaving Army Group North isolated and vulnerable to encirclement. Soviet forces had achieved major breakthroughs in Latvia and Poland during the summer of 1944, threatening to trap German forces in the Baltic region and destroy them before they could retreat to Germany. German commanders ordered withdrawal from Narva on August 16 to shorten their defensive lines and avoid being cut off, abandoning positions they had held for 6 months, not because Soviet attacks had defeated them locally, but because strategic collapse elsewhere made the position untenable. The German withdrawal from Narva between August 16 to 20, 1944, proceeded as a fighting retreat, with rearguard actions that inflicted additional casualties on pursuing Soviet forces, while main German units pulled back to new defensive positions in Latvia. Estonian volunteers faced an agonizing decision during this withdrawal because retreating west meant abandoning their homeland to Soviet occupation, while remaining behind meant certain execution or deportation to Siberia. Most Estonian soldiers chose to retreat with German forces, hoping that eventual German defeat might still lead to Estonian independence if Western allies intervened, though this hope proved entirely misplaced as the Yalta Conference would consign the Baltic states to Soviet control. The final casualty accounting from the Battle of Narva varies depending on source, but the most careful estimates based on Soviet archival documents released after the Cold War suggest approximately 200,000 total deaths from both sides during the six-month campaign. Soviet deaths probably exceeded 130,000, while German and Estonian deaths approached 70,000, creating an overall exchange ratio of nearly 2-to-1 in favor of the defenders. When wounded are included, total casualties from the campaign exceeded 600,000 eyes, making it one of the bloodiest battles of the Eastern Front, despite occurring on a front barely 12 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The comparison between Narva and D-Day becomes even more striking when casualty rates are examined as percentage of forces engaged. D-Day involved approximately 150,000 Allied troops landing on June 6, with first-day casualties around 10,000 hours, representing roughly 7% casualties. The Narva campaign involved over 1 million combatants during its 6 months, with 200,000 killed, representing 20% killed and perhaps 60% total casualties, including wounded. The intensity of combat at Narva thus far exceeded D-Day when measured by casualty rates, yet historical memory treats D-Day as the defining battle of 1944, while Narva remains obscure. The reasons for Narva's obscurity in Western historical consciousness include obvious factors like Soviet control of the narrative that minimized embarrassing failures and Estonian inability to share their perspective during decades of occupation. More fundamentally, Narva lacked the clear strategic importance and symbolic value of D-Day, because it represented defensive success for Germany rather than Allied advance, and Western audiences had little interest in celebrating German defensive victories even when they came at terrible cost. The moral complexity of Estonian soldiers fighting alongside Germans against Soviets also made Narva difficult to fit into simplified narratives of good versus evil that dominated immediate post-war historical accounts. Modern Estonian commemoration of the Battle of Narva reflects careful balancing of multiple historical truths that resist simple heroic framing. Estonian veterans are honored for defending their homeland against an enemy that would indeed prove brutal during 50 years of occupation, while acknowledgement is given that they fought as part of German organized forces, even if individual Estonian units avoided direct involvement in Nazi atrocities. Estonian historians emphasize that Estonian volunteers faced an impossible choice between two totalitarian occupiers and chose the one that offered any possibility of eventual independence rather than guaranteed absorption into the Soviet Empire. The physical landscape around Narva still bears marks of the 1944 battle, with trenches, bunkers, and fortifications preserved as historical sites, though many have been reclaimed by vegetation over decades. The Sinimäed Hills, where the Tannenberg line anchored German defenses, feature a memorial complex and museum documenting the battle, and annual ceremonies commemorate Estonian soldiers who fought there. These sites receive modest numbers of visitors because Estonia's tourism focuses primarily on Tallinn's medieval architecture and the country's natural beauty, rather than grim military history. The Battle of Narva ultimately demonstrated that even in 1944, when Soviet forces had achieved massive material superiority over German defenders, well-prepared defensive positions could still resist even the largest offensives if defenders possessed sufficient skill and determination. The battle also revealed the terrible cost of Soviet offensive tactics that relied on overwhelming defenders through numerical superiority, rather than maneuver or infiltration that might have achieved breakthrough with fewer casualties. German defenders at Narva proved that defensive warfare could still succeed in the age of mechanized combat when conducted by skilled troops in strong positions, though strategic collapse elsewhere eventually rendered even successful local defense meaningless. The forgotten soldiers who died at Narva deserve recognition as victims of total war, who fought with courage and determination regardless of which side they supported or which cause ultimately prevailed. Soviet soldiers who attacked the Tannenberg line followed orders and died by tens of thousands in pursuit of objectives their commanders insisted were vital. German soldiers who defended Narva held positions they were ordered to maintain despite hopeless strategic situation. Estonian volunteers who fought to defend their homeland faced impossible moral choices and paid terrible price for their decision to resist Soviet return. All of them experienced combat as intense as any battle of World War II and died in numbers exceeding famous Western Front engagements. Yet their sacrifice remains largely unknown beyond Estonia and military history specialists. The legacy of the Battle of Narva reminds us that historical memory is selective and often unjust, that casualties and suffering on the Eastern Front exceeded Western Front by orders of magnitude, yet receive fraction of attention in popular historical consciousness, and that moral complexity in warfare often resists the simplified narratives that make history comfortable to teach and remember. The 200,000 men who died along the Narva River in 1944 deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a forgotten battle, but as individuals who fought and suffered and died in one of history's bloodiest campaigns, a meat grinder that exceeded D-Day in casualties, yet remains almost completely unknown to the wider world.